Inside a climate-controlled archive in Washington, D.C., historians once opened a military folder dated 1919 and immediately noticed something unusual. The pages weren't torn, they weren't water-damaged, they weren't lost to time. Thick black ink had been applied with precision, line after line, paragraph after paragraph, not randomly, but deliberately. Across the top of the first page, a red stamp pressed deep into the paper read, "Redacted." Not classified, not restricted, redacted. At a moment when the United States was emerging from World War I, someone had decided parts of this story could never be allowed to exist in full. The war overseas had ended, but peace did not arrive quietly. Across the United States, soldiers returned carrying more than medals. They brought knowledge of chemical agents, experimental munitions, and battlefield tactics the public barely understood. In government corridors throughout Washington, D.C., officials faced a new challenge: how to transition from wartime secrecy to peacetime transparency without exposing vulnerabilities. The closing chapter of World War I had reshaped military intelligence, expanding its authority and refining its methods. Offices that handled troop logistics now processed sensitive internal investigations. Reports moved behind locked doors. Language grew cautious. It was during this uneasy shift, when fear of unrest mixed with national pride, that a single military file was stamped in red ink and altered before it was ever fully read. What happened next would leave gaps not just in paper records, but in personal histories. South of Baltimore, beyond the busier rail corridors that connected Maryland to the capital, stretched a tract of land that had once been farmland before the Army converted it into a wartime training installation. The property sat on gently rolling terrain bordered by dense tree lines and cut through by a narrow service road that disappeared into guarded gates. During the height of America's involvement in World War I, the site functioned as a munitions handling and field simulation ground, the kind of place rarely mentioned in newspapers but essential to preparing troops for modern combat. Unlike larger, well-documented bases, this installation operated with minimal publicity. Supply trains arrived at irregular hours, freight manifests listed generic descriptions, industrial materials, protective equipment, engineering stock. Local railway workers later recalled that some shipments required additional armed escorts, unusual for standard drilling supplies. Even by wartime standards, the caution seemed excessive. The surrounding communities were small, clusters of farmhouses, a general store, a Methodist church, and open pasture land. Residents were accustomed to the distant percussion of controlled detonations. It had become part of the landscape, like summer thunder rolling across the fields. But toward the end of the war, the pattern changed. Explosions became less frequent, replaced by long stretches of unnatural quiet, followed by sudden nighttime activity. Lanterns moved along the perimeter fence, wagons rolled in after midnight. Guards who once chatted casually with locals began turning visitors away without explanation. Weather records from the region describe an unseasonably heavy fog settling over the area during one particular week. Farmers later described a sharp metallic scent lingering in the air, not the familiar odor of gunpowder, but something more acrid. Livestock reportedly grew agitated. One family claimed their well water tasted different for several days, though no formal complaint was ever logged in county health reports. Inside the installation, documentation becomes thinner. Routine drill logs that once detailed daily exercises suddenly shift in tone. Instead of listing standard field maneuvers, entries reference containment checks and restricted perimeter adjustments. The language grows clinical and restrained. Personnel rosters show temporary reassignment of several specialists trained in chemical handling, expertise developed in response to gas warfare overseas. Their presence suggests the base's function had evolved beyond conventional drills. Maps from the era show a specific quadrant of the property marked only with grid coordinates, not descriptive labels. That section, according to later surveys, included a low-lying clearing bordered by drainage trenches. It would have been an ideal location for controlled testing or for isolating something that had gone wrong. What stands out most is the abrupt change that followed. Civilian access roads skirting the installation were rerouted. A nearby farmhouse, once positioned just outside the northern boundary, was absorbed into federal property through emergency acquisition. County tax records confirm the transfer but provide no detailed justification beyond military necessity. Photographs of the base taken earlier in the war depict open training fields and clearly marked structures. Images dated months later show additional fencing and canvas-covered frameworks shielding certain sections from view. The transformation suggests urgency, not expansion for growth, but reinforcement against exposure. By the time hostilities overseas had ceased, the installation no longer resembled a routine training ground. It had become compartmentalized, layered with internal restrictions. Activity continued even as other wartime sites began decommissioning. To an outsider, the land would have appeared unchanged, fields, trees, and low wooden structures blending into the Maryland countryside. But beneath that ordinary exterior, procedures had shifted. Language and logs grew sparse, movements became deliberate, and somewhere within that restricted quadrant, events unfolded that would later require not just explanation, but erasure. The place itself holds no monument. No roadside marker identifies it as historically significant. The fields have long since been repurposed, the fences dismantled. Yet archival fragments and property records preserve a different image, a quiet stretch of land where routine military preparation slowly transformed into something guarded, controlled, and ultimately obscured from the official narrative. Before the file was stamped red, before names were blacked out, there was this place, isolated, active, and increasingly difficult to explain. The paper trail begins miles away from the Maryland training ground, inside the administrative arteries of Washington, D.C. During the post-war transition, the War Department processed thousands of reports each week. Deployment summaries, casualty updates, supply reconciliations, disciplinary reviews. Most followed a rigid structure: date, commanding officer, operational summary, signatures. The file connected to the Maryland installation does follow that structure, at least on the surface. Its cover sheet is routine. It lists 3 Army intelligence officers assigned to what is described as a containment review detail. The language suggests oversight, not emergency response. A review, not a crisis. The first page references a field inspection conducted after an irregular event during munitions handling. The term is vague, but not uncommon. Wartime reports frequently soften terminology to avoid unnecessary alarm. Yet as the pages progress, the tone shifts from procedural to guarded. Entire paragraphs are obscured by thick black ink, not hastily applied strokes, but careful, uniform redaction. The ink does not bleed. It was applied deliberately before the document was archived. That detail matters. These pages were not censored decades later. They were altered at the moment of filing. Archival catalog entries confirm the file's existence continuously since the early 1920s. It was never marked destroyed. It was never misplaced. It remained accessible, but incomplete. What survives between the redactions offers fragments of context. One visible line references exposure radius beyond projected perimeter. Another mentions civilian variables unaccounted for. The phrasing suggests calculation, not chaos. Something measurable occurred, and it extended beyond expectations. Personnel rosters attached to the file show the names of the 3 officers assigned to the review. Their backgrounds are notable. All had experience analyzing battlefield gas deployments during World War I. They were not logistics officers or infantry supervisors. They were specialists trained to assess chemical risk. The next section of the file should contain their joint findings. Instead, it contains redacted space. Signature lines remain at the bottom of the page, confirming that a report was completed and authenticated, but the substance of their conclusions, the analysis, the measurements, the recommendations, has been entirely obscured. A routing slip attached to the back of the folder reveals something else. The document was forwarded beyond standard War Department channels. A notation indicates distribution to an internal investigative bureau, an early domestic intelligence office that would eventually evolve into what is now known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Why would a training site incident require intelligence oversight? That question becomes sharper when examining subsequent correspondence. A follow-up memo references narrative stabilization. The phrase appears bureaucratic, but in context, it implies management of public perception. The memo outlines recommended language for any potential civilian inquiries: accidental discharge, no lasting hazard, no verified exposure. There is no evidence in the file of a public announcement. No press release survives. No congressional inquiry appears in related archives. Equally revealing is what does not appear. Medical reports for base personnel during that month are filed separately in other collections, except for the week corresponding to the irregular event. That segment is absent entirely, not redacted, but missing. Archivists who later reviewed the file noted that its classification terminology was ahead of its time. The stamp Redacted appears in a format that would not become standardized until later intelligence reforms. In 1919, documents were typically labeled confidential or restricted. Redaction as a procedural category was rare. This suggests premeditation. The file was structured not merely to record an event, but to control how that event would be remembered. Cross-referencing transportation logs reveals that rail shipments leaving the Maryland site increased briefly after the review. Freight descriptions shift from munition supplies to material disposal. The timing aligns with the redacted report. There are no dramatic annotations in the margins, no frantic handwriting. The calmness of the documentation is almost more unsettling than panic would have been. It reads like a system performing exactly as intended, identifying a problem, containing it, and then minimizing its trace. The redactions do not shout, they conceal. And in their uniform black lines, they leave just enough visible text to suggest that something measurable, potentially harmful, and politically sensitive occurred beyond the controlled boundaries of a military installation. The records do not accuse, but they do not fully explain. They sit in archival boxes, cataloged and preserved, offering historians an outline without a center, a structure with its core removed. And at the center of that absence lies the question the red ink was meant to silence. Beyond the perimeter fences and blacked-out pages, the story narrows into something more personal. One of the 3 officers assigned to the containment review detail lived with his family in Alexandria, Virginia, just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Census records confirm his address, a modest row house within walking distance of the rail line. He was not a career bureaucrat. Before the war, he had studied engineering, a background that made him valuable when chemical warfare reshaped modern combat during World War I. Photographs preserved by distant relatives show a composed man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reserved expression. In letters sent home during overseas service, his tone was analytical rather than dramatic. He described wind patterns, equipment failures, the mathematics of exposure distances. Even in personal correspondence, he wrote like someone trained to measure risk. After returning stateside, he was reassigned to intelligence review work, quieter, less visible, but no less important. When he left for the Maryland installation tied to the redacted file, his wife reportedly told neighbors it was routine inspection duty. There was no ceremony, no urgency. His final known letter arrived 3 days after he reached the site. The surviving fragment, preserved in family papers decades later, mentions an unexpected variable during a disposal procedure. He reassured his wife that there was no cause for alarm and that containment was underway. The tone suggests he was still confident in process and protocol. Then, the letters stopped. Military pay records indicate his salary allotment was suspended within weeks. There is no documentation of a formal discharge. No death certificate appears in Virginia civil registries for that period under his name. When his wife contacted the War Department seeking clarification, she received a brief typed reply. Service concluded. Records sealed under authority. The phrasing is unusual. Standard casualty notices of the era were more direct: killed in action, died of illness, missing in service. Service concluded implies closure without explanation. Neighbors later recalled that uniformed officials visited the home once. The conversation was brief and private. Afterward, the officer's wife stopped speaking publicly about her husband's assignment. Church records note her presence but contain no mention of a funeral service. Family lore shifted over time. To friends, she said he had succumbed to complications related to influenza, a plausible explanation in the wake of the 1918 pandemic. The story carried no scandal, no secrecy. It allowed mourning without inquiry. But privately, questions lingered. Decades later, a grandson would search military archives and find only fragments: deployment confirmation, salary records, and then silence. The redacted file references 3 officers, but their individual medical evaluations are absent from separate War Department collections. It is as if their professional identities were absorbed into the incident itself. The emotional weight of this absence rests not in dramatic confrontation, but in its quiet finality. There was no public acknowledgement of sacrifice, no medal presentation, no gravesite to visit. The family adapted. The wife took in sewing work. The son grew up with a story that changed slightly depending on who was asking. By the time he enlisted during the next global conflict, he reportedly told recruiters that his father had served honorably and passed during government duty. Even he did not know more than that. The human cost of sealed files is rarely recorded in bold headlines. It manifests in altered family narratives, in children who inherit questions rather than history. If the Maryland installation incident involved exposure beyond its intended boundary, the officer's expertise would have placed him at the center of assessing damage. Specialists trained in chemical risk understood what contamination could mean, not just for soldiers, but for civilians. The redacted pages remove the official explanation, but the abrupt end of correspondence, the sealed service designation, and the absence of a public record create a quieter conclusion. His life does not end in documented heroism or confirmed misconduct. It ends in administrative closure. And for his family, that bureaucratic phrasing replaced certainty with ambiguity, a void where answers should have been, echoing long after the ink dried on a file stamped in red. Silence rarely arrives all at once. It settles gradually, replacing noise with absence so slowly that, at first, no one calls it by its name. Around the Maryland installation, daily life resumed its outward rhythm. Crops were planted, church bells rang on schedule, freight trains continued passing through small depots along the line toward Baltimore. But beneath that ordinary routine, Subtle adjustments suggested something unresolved. County property records show that within weeks of the officer's visit, an adjacent parcel of farmland was acquired under emergency federal authority. The justification listed was brief: security expansion. The land had belonged to a family who had lived there for over a decade. Census listings confirm their presence before the acquisition. Afterward, their names no longer appear in local directories. There is no documented relocation order, no record of compensation disputes, no obituary marking their departure. It is as though the household stepped sideways out of the official record. Neighbors interviewed decades later recalled wagons arriving before sunrise on one particular morning. Military personnel reportedly removed household furnishings and sealed the well. By nightfall, the property stood vacant, curtains drawn, doors locked, no visible commotion. The War Department's quarterly summary for that period contains a reassuring line: no civilian disturbances reported in proximity to training installations. The phrasing is careful. It does not state that no disturbances occurred, it states none were reported. The distinction matters. Local newspapers from the surrounding counties make no mention of unusual events. Editors at the time were often reluctant to challenge federal operations, particularly in the fragile months following World War I. Patriotism remained strong. Public scrutiny of military procedure was limited. Meanwhile, routine base logs continue in clipped, technical language. Guard rotations are documented. Supply shipments are noted. But there is an unusual gap in medical entries: a full week without recorded examinations or treatments in a facility that typically processed dozens of minor injuries and routine checkups. When documentation disappears selectively, it signals intention rather than accident. Rail manifests reveal that shortly after the containment review, several outbound shipments were categorized as material disposal. The cargo descriptions are generic, offering no specifics. The timing aligns with the sudden quiet that enveloped the surrounding community. Oral histories collected in the 1970s add texture but not confirmation. One elderly resident described seeing uniformed men burning piles of fabric behind the perimeter fence. Another recalled a trench being dug near the drainage field and refilled before dusk. Memory can blur over decades, but consistency across separate accounts suggests that something out of the ordinary occurred. Silence also took bureaucratic form. Requests filed by a state health official seeking clarification on environmental safety were reportedly redirected to federal jurisdiction. The correspondence trail ends abruptly with a note indicating that further inquiry would be unnecessary. Unnecessary for whom? Within the base, operations gradually scaled down. Training schedules decreased. Personnel were reassigned. By the following year, portions of the installation were listed as inactive. Officially, the war's conclusion made the downsizing logical. Unofficially, the timing feels accelerated. Silence is not merely the absence of speech, it is the presence of controlled narrative. The federal summary reports emphasize stability. The lack of civilian complaints is cited as evidence of order. Yet the disappearance of a neighboring household, the altered land boundaries, and the medical record gap form a pattern that resists easy dismissal. Perhaps the exposure event referenced in the redacted file was contained quickly and effectively. Perhaps the measures taken were precautionary rather than reactive. But precaution rarely requires erasing names from directories or sealing wells under guard. The silence extended beyond documents into memory itself. Children who grew up in nearby towns later described being told not to wander near the old grounds. Parents offered no explanation, only firm instruction. Over time, the installation faded from local conversation. The land was repurposed, fences came down, new development replaced open fields. Yet the quiet that followed the incident feels less like peace and more like compression, pressure applied to prevent something from surfacing. When history grows quiet without resolution, it invites a different kind of listening. Not for what is said, but for what stopped being said altogether. Time has a way of loosening floorboards. Long after the Maryland installation had been decommissioned and absorbed into civilian development, attention shifted to a different federal property across the river in Arlington, Virginia. The structure had once served as a War Department storage annex, a quiet administrative building that processed overflow records during the surge of paperwork following World War I. By the early 1960s, the building was slated for renovation. Fluorescent lighting would replace aging fixtures. Damaged hardwood flooring was to be removed. The project was routine until workers pried up a section of boards in a back office that had not been updated since the 1920s. Beneath the joists sat a narrow metal dispatch case. It was not labeled for destruction. It was not cataloged in the building's inventory ledger. It appeared to have been placed deliberately in a cavity between support beams, shielded from casual discovery. The top document bore a familiar heading, War Department, Internal Memorandum. The date corresponded to the same week as the containment review at the Maryland installation. Unlike the redacted file preserved in archives, these pages were not blacked out. They were damaged instead, corners singed, sections partially burned, as though someone had begun to destroy them and then stopped. One surviving paragraph referenced chemical dispersal exceeding projected containment radius. The language was technical, precise, unmistakably concerned with measurement rather than rumor. It detailed wind direction, estimated exposure distance, and the potential for unintended civilian contact. Another page contained a map fragment. Grid coordinates overlapped farmland previously absorbed under emergency federal authority. A notation beside the coordinates read, "Unplanned variable." The most unsettling document was a short directive typed on thin government stationery. It did not describe the incident itself, it described the response. Civilian awareness unacceptable. Immediate narrative adjustment required. File to be amended prior to formal archive submission. The phrase narrative adjustment echoed the routing slip language in the redacted archive copy. Here, however, it appeared without ink covering it. There were no signatures on the directive, only typed initials. Renovation supervisors reportedly notified a federal records officer. The documents were photographed, logged, and transferred. Official statements later described the materials as duplicate administrative drafts of no historical consequence. Yet the existence of drafts implies revision, and revision implies an original version that differed from the one preserved. What makes the discovery significant is not that it reveals dramatic new accusations. It does not confirm casualty numbers. It does not list names of civilians harmed. Instead, it exposes process. It shows that the redactions in the archived file were not routine. They were intentional modifications guided by directive. Cross-referencing the map coordinates with later property surveys reveals that the trench field near the installation's drainage quadrant lay directly downwind from the farmhouse that disappeared from county records. Prevailing wind data from that week supports the possibility of drift beyond the fenced perimeter. Possibility is not proof, but possibility paired with deliberate narrative revision invites scrutiny. The dispatch case raises another question. Why conceal these drafts rather than destroy them completely? Perhaps the individual who hid them intended to preserve evidence quietly. Perhaps they hesitated at the threshold between obedience and conscience. The partial burn marks suggest interruption, an abandoned attempt at eradication. When historians later requested access to the rediscovered documents, they encountered the same language that had defined the original file: restricted, sensitive, Redacted. Portions were once again obscured before public release. History had circled back on itself. The building in Arlington has since been modernized, the floorboards replaced, office partitions reconfigured. No visible sign remains of the cavity where the metal case rested for decades. But its contents altered the narrative from speculation to documentation of intent. The Maryland incident was not merely an unfortunate accident handled quietly. It was a story consciously reshaped. And beneath the black ink of the official archive, the burned edges of those draft pages whisper a version of events that almost survived intact.
If the discovery in Arlington exposed the mechanics of revision, it also revealed something broader, the culture that made revision possible. In the aftermath of World War I, the United States was redefining its relationship with secrecy. Wartime censorship had conditioned both officials and the public to accept limited disclosure in the name of stability. Information, once released freely, was now filtered through emerging intelligence structures. Internal security concerns were rising. Labor unrest, political radicalism, and fear of foreign influence created an atmosphere where control of narrative felt synonymous with national protection. Within that climate, a chemical containment failure, especially one extending beyond military boundaries, would not have been viewed merely as an operational mistake. It would have been seen as a vulnerability. The War Department's authority at the time was expansive. Oversight mechanisms that later constrained federal secrecy were not yet firmly established. There was no modern freedom of information framework. Congressional review of intelligence matters was limited and often informal. In practical terms, if officials determined that a record posed a risk to public confidence or strategic security, they possessed both the discretion and the procedural tools to alter its presentation. The documents recovered from Arlington suggest that the process unfolded methodically. First came technical assessment, wind patterns, dispersal radius, exposure variables. Then came administrative language, containment review, irregular event. Finally came narrative control, civilian awareness unacceptable. The phrase is clinical, not emotional. It does not accuse civilians of panic. It frames knowledge itself as the threat. When the file was officially archived in Washington, D.C., its redactions were already in place. The black ink did not erase the event, it reshaped its footprint. Instead of a measurable exposure beyond projected boundaries, the surviving text describes a contained disposal irregularity with no verified impact. That distinction is everything. A contained irregularity suggests competence. An exposure beyond projection suggests miscalculation. The disappearance of the neighboring farmhouse from public record aligns with this shift. Emergency federal acquisition transformed a potential liability into controlled property. Without residents to question environmental effects, there would be no external testimony to contradict the official version. The officer whose service was concluded without explanation fits the same pattern. If exposure affected personnel involved in assessment, acknowledging that outcome would invite further inquiry. Administrative closure avoided public categorization of cause. Even the missing medical logs from the installation reflect strategy. Removing a week of health documentation prevents correlation. Without records, patterns cannot be established. It is important to distinguish between dramatic conspiracy and institutional preservation. Nothing in the surviving evidence suggests a sprawling secret network operating outside government authority. Instead, it points to a centralized decision: minimize disruption, maintain confidence, protect operational credibility. In 1919, the country was weary. The influenza pandemic had strained communities. Demobilization created economic uncertainty. Public trust in military leadership was critical during this transition. From the perspective of officials, releasing news of a chemical dispersal beyond a controlled site might have seemed reckless. Containment of information may have been viewed as another form of damage control. But secrecy carries cost. When files are altered, families lose clarity. When land is absorbed quietly, communities lose memory. When language is softened, accountability dissolves into abstraction. The cover-up, if that word applies, was not theatrical. There were no midnight shreddings broadcast in headlines. There were memoranda, routing slips, and careful strokes of ink. The system did not collapse under scandal. It functioned, and that is what makes it enduring. Because when procedure itself becomes the instrument of erasure, history does not vanish in flames. It fades line by line until only the outline of truth remains, preserved in fragments too incomplete to accuse, yet too deliberate to ignore.
What remains of the redacted military file is not a dramatic confession or a definitive indictment. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling. It is a demonstration of how institutions decide what survives on paper and what dissolves into absence. The Maryland installation no longer resembles the restricted training ground it once was. The fences are gone. The drainage fields have been repurposed. Commuters pass through the region without realizing that a century earlier, calculations were made there about wind direction and exposure radius. The land looks ordinary again. But the record does not fully return to ordinary. In archives, historians are trained to read what is present. Yet experienced researchers often learn that what is missing can speak just as clearly. The black ink in the 1919 file does not merely obscure sentences, it signals a deliberate boundary around truth. It tells us that someone, at some level of authority, evaluated information and concluded it should not travel beyond a certain circle. That act alone reshapes history. We often imagine historical cover-ups as explosive revelations waiting to be uncovered. But in reality, concealment is usually procedural. It happens through classification stamps, routing slips, and revised summaries. It happens when a phrase like irregular event replaces more precise technical language. It happens when a service record is marked concluded instead of explained. The result is not an obvious void. It is a managed narrative. Consider the family in Alexandria, Virginia, who received no public acknowledgement of loss. Their private uncertainty became part of the cost of maintaining institutional confidence. Consider the farmhouse near the installation that slipped from directories after federal acquisition. A household vanished not through spectacle, but through paperwork. None of these elements alone prove deliberate wrongdoing on a grand scale. There is no signed confession preserved in a drawer, no dramatic trial that was suppressed. Instead, there is a pattern: exposure calculations followed by narrative adjustment, personnel reassignment followed by sealed service, land transfer followed by silence. The period after World War I was defined by transition. America was redefining itself as a global power while grappling with domestic anxiety. In such moments, governments often prioritize stability over transparency. Information becomes something to manage rather than share. From one perspective, the redactions may have been viewed as responsible governance, preventing panic, protecting national credibility, avoiding diplomatic embarrassment. From another perspective, they represent a narrowing of the historical record that leaves later generations with partial truths. The most striking feature of the file is not what it says, but how carefully it was edited before anyone outside a small circle could read it. The black ink was not chaotic, it was measured. The concealment was structured. And yet, despite those efforts, fragments endured. A partially burned draft hidden beneath floorboards, a routing slip referencing narrative stabilization, a missing week of medical logs that draws attention precisely because of its absence. History is rarely erased completely. It resists total disappearance. Pieces remain, enough to suggest outlines, enough to invite reconstruction, even if certainty remains out of reach. Perhaps no civilians suffered lasting harm. Perhaps the containment was effective enough to prevent catastrophe. The surviving record cannot confirm the full extent of impact. What it does confirm is that perception mattered deeply to those in authority. In the end, the redacted file stands as a reminder that archives are not neutral landscapes. They are curated spaces shaped by decisions made under pressure, influenced by politics, fear, and reputation. We inherit the edited version, but occasionally, through overlooked drafts and inconsistencies, we glimpse the margins where the original story once stood. And in those margins, we are reminded that the absence of detail is itself a detail, one that challenges us to question how much of history is complete and how much has been carefully compressed into silence. Some histories aren't destroyed. They're edited until they barely resemble the truth. If you want to uncover more forgotten files and buried records, subscribe and stay with us, because sometimes the most revealing stories are the ones someone tried hardest to hide.